There are stories history chooses to tell, and then there are the ones it tries to bury beneath centuries of silence. This is one of those stories. Her name was Amelia, though it could have been 1,000 other names. 1,000 other women whose voices were swallowed by the blood-soaked earth of ancient Greece. She lived in a small city on the edge of the Peloponnese where olive trees bent in the wind and men still believed their shields could protect the world they knew. Then one morning, that world ended, and what happened next was something history has struggled to speak aloud ever since. The Spartans came before dawn. The sky was heavy with ash and smoke, turning the sunrise into something unrecognizable, something wrong. Amelia's husband had kissed her forehead the night before, promised he would return, and joined the other men at the walls. They fought with everything they had, but against Sparta's iron discipline, courage was just another word for futility. By noon, the walls had fallen. By dusk, the streets were silent except for the sound of footsteps. The measured, rhythmic footsteps of victory for some and extinction for others. Amelia searched among the bodies scattered through the marketplace, hoping against hope that she wouldn't find him, that somehow he had escaped. Instead, she found only his cloak, torn and blackened with blood, still warm from the man who had worn it. She wanted to scream, but fear closed around her throat like a hand. All around her, women were being gathered, not rescued, not comforted, but claimed. The Spartan soldiers moved through the ruins with a purpose that was somehow more terrifying than rage would have been. They weren't drunk on victory or wild with bloodlust. They were methodical, efficient, following a plan that had been perfected through generations of conquest, because Spartan soldiers were not like other warriors. They didn't plunder for gold or glory alone. They plundered for control, for a kind of dominance that went far deeper than any blade could reach. Every conquest was not just about taking land, it was about erasing futures and rewriting bloodlines. To destroy a city was to erase its tomorrow, and the wives of the fallen became the soil from which Sparta grew its terrible power. Amelia was taken. No one explained where or why. Her tears meant nothing to her captors. Her name, the name her mother had whispered to her as a child, meant nothing now. She had become part of what Sparta called order, a system built on obedience, silence, and the systematic breaking of human spirits. As night fell and she was led away from everything she had ever known, she looked back one final time toward the ruins of her home. The wind carried the faint smell of burning grain and wet stone, and she understood with terrible clarity that she would never return. Her story, as tragic as it was not unique. It was a pattern, a quiet and systematic cruelty that reached far beyond one woman's pain. And this was how Sparta built its glory. On the backs and broken hearts of people whose names would never be carved in stone. Now, to understand what happened to Amelia and the thousands like her, we must understand Sparta itself, not as a city of heroes, but as a machine designed for a single purpose. Sparta was not built for beauty or trade or the pursuit of knowledge. It was built for war, and everything else was secondary. From the moment a Spartan boy could walk, he was taken from his mother and trained to obey without question. His childhood was stolen, his emotions starved, his compassion burned away in fires of discipline so harsh they would seem monstrous to any other culture. Every heartbeat was devoted to strength, and every sign of weakness was treated as a sin against the state itself. The famous Spartan warriors, the ones we celebrate in movies and books, were created through a process that stripped away everything soft, everything human, until only the weapon remained. But here's what most people don't understand. A machine cannot run without fuel, and Sparta's fuel was the suffering of others. The lands it conquered, the people it enslaved, the women it claimed, these kept the Spartan state alive. The enslaved population, called Helots, were mostly from Messene, a region that had been crushed beneath Sparta's heel for so many generations that resistance seemed impossible. Helots worked the fields, raised the crops, and fed the warriors who despised them. They were beaten, humiliated, and sometimes murdered as a lesson, a ritual reminder of who ruled and who obeyed. The Spartans called this order. To the rest of Greece, it looked like terror wrapped in law and justified by tradition. Sparta's victories were never random acts of aggression. Each conquest had a calculated purpose, to ensure that no free man or woman could ever rise against them again. Cities were broken, names were erased, and survivors were reduced to tools in a system that had perfected the art of domination. And for women like Amelia, the body itself became the final battlefield. Because when Sparta conquered a city, it didn't just take its land or its wealth, it took its future. While poets in Athens wrote beautiful words about freedom and virtue, Sparta built an empire on fear, efficient, silent, and absolutely merciless. This was not chaos or the random brutality of wartime. This was systematic domination perfected through centuries of practice. And what it did to the women of conquered peoples was something that even now, thousands of years later, is almost too dark to fully comprehend. If stories like this matter to you, if you believe these forgotten voices deserve to be heard, please subscribe, because history is not just about celebrating victories. It's about mourning what was lost to achieve them, and these are the stories that need to be told. Let me tell you what it truly meant to be conquered by Sparta, because the horror didn't end when the battle was over. When the last defender fell silent and the smoke began to clear, the victors turned their attention to what remained, the women. Most of ancient Greece, women had limited freedom, constrained by laws and customs that placed them under the authority of fathers and husbands. But in defeat, they lost even that small measure of autonomy. To the Spartans, the wives and daughters of fallen enemies were not humans deserving of mercy. They were spoils of war, living trophies, and most chillingly, tools of control. The destruction of a city did not end with its walls crumbling or its defenders being cut down. It continued through the systematic domination of its women, a process designed to erase the conquered people from existence. Spartan law and custom treated reproduction as a weapon, perhaps the most effective weapon of all. Every Spartan warrior was trained to believe that strength must be preserved and spread, that the blood of the strong should replace the blood of the weak. To destroy an enemy completely, you couldn't just kill his soldiers, you had to erase his bloodline, replace it with your own, and make his people forget who they had been. Women like Amelia became part of this system, caught in a quiet, methodical conquest that continued long after the spears had been lowered and the battlefield had gone silent. Some were forced into servitude, compelled to bear children for their captors, children who would grow up as Spartans and never know their mother's true heritage. Others were taken as concubines or forced wives under Spartan control, a title that masked their essential captivity behind a veneer of legitimacy. In rare cases, women of noble birth were offered to Spartan warriors as rewards for exceptional valor in battle. In all cases, their bodies were no longer their own, and their choices had been reduced to nothing. But this was not merely physical domination, it was psychological warfare of the most insidious kind. Imagine being forced to raise a child who belonged to the society that murdered your family. Imagine watching your language fade from use, your gods forgotten, your identity slowly dissolving into silence. Imagine knowing that your own child would be taught to despise everything you once were. Sparta called this stability, the natural order of things. Modern historians, when they're being honest, call it systematic erasure, the deliberate destruction of a people's identity through the bodies of their women. For the wives of the fallen, survival was not a blessing or a mercy, it was a punishment that repeated itself with every breath, every day spent in service to those who had destroyed everything they loved. And yet history barely speaks their names. Their suffering was not carved into marble monuments or sung by poets in grand halls. It existed in the spaces between the official records, vast and unrecorded and unspeakable, because Sparta didn't need to write its cruelty down for posterity. It simply lived it, day after day, generation after generation, until domination became so normal that it was almost invisible. The women themselves were expected to be invisible, to accept their fate with the same silent obedience that Sparta demanded from everyone under its control. The Spartans understood something that went deeper than military tactics or battlefield strategy. They understood that fear lasts longer than steel, that psychological dominance can be more permanent than any fortress wall. They didn't need to station armies in every conquered town because they ruled through memory, shame, and the crushing weight of silence. When a city fell, it wasn't just the warriors who were defeated. The city's stories, its songs, its gods, everything that made it alive and distinct was methodically stripped away. Women were forced to abandon their native language and learn the tongue of their conquerors. The names of their ancestors were forbidden, treated as dangerous secrets that could spark rebellion. Children born from Spartan masters were taught from their earliest years to despise the people their mothers came from, to see their maternal heritage as a source of shame rather than pride. This was a war against identity itself, a quiet and invisible war that never ended, not even when the physical battles were long over. Amelia, like countless others, was not chained in literal iron, but she was chained nonetheless, bound by obedience and the constant threat of what would happen if she stepped out of line. She was told when to speak and when to remain silent, when to work and when to bow, when to smile and when to disappear. Her silence became her survival strategy, the only way to protect what little remained of herself. The Spartans didn't need to break her body with torture or violence. They broke her world, shattered everything that gave her life meaning, and then demanded that she live within the ruins they had created. For them, this was order, this was justice, this was the natural way of things. To prevent resistance before it could even begin, they destroyed pride at its source. Every woman's body became a message broadcast to any who might think of defying Sparta. This is what happens to those who stand against us. This is the price of resistance. And yet, despite everything, inside that enforced silence, a hidden resistance lived on in ways the Spartans could never fully control. There were songs whispered to children at night when no one else was listening. There were prayers muttered in secret, in languages that were supposed to be forgotten. There were old names remembered through tears, passed down from mother to daughter in moments of desperate intimacy. These were acts of defiance, small and quiet and easily overlooked, but defiance nonetheless. Sparta could not understand such strength because it was born not from domination but from love, from the refusal to let memory die even when hope seemed impossible. When you erase the mother, when you silence the one who carries culture and identity forward, you erase the nation itself. And that was exactly what Sparta intended, to replace whole peoples with obedient shadows who knew nothing but submission. This was not just war in the traditional sense. This was a psychological empire, one that conquered minds and spirits as thoroughly as it conquered lands and cities. But empires built on cruelty carry the seeds of their own destruction, and Sparta was no exception. The same ideology that allowed it to dominate others eventually consumed Sparta from within. The population of true Spartan citizens began to shrink dramatically. Few children were born, and fewer still survived the brutal system designed to create perfect warriors. The helots, who made up the vast majority of the population, outnumbered their masters by thousands to one. Fear kept them subdued, but fear is not infinite. Rebellions erupted again and again, and each time Sparta had to pour its dwindling strength into suppressing the very people it had broken. While other Greek cities grew rich through trade and innovation, Sparta remained frozen in time, producing no art, no literature, no scientific advancement, only warriors. And when its military power finally faded, there was nothing left to sustain it. No culture, no commerce, no reason for its existence beyond the violence it could no longer maintain. The same discipline that made Sparta legendary also made it hollow, and hollow things eventually collapse under their own weight. Imagine those famous training fields now, overgrown with wild grass and forgotten. The temples silent, the sound of marching feet replaced by wind whistling through empty corridors. A city that once ruled through fear, now forgotten by time itself, leaving behind only ruins and cautionary tales. Sparta won many battles, but it lost its soul in the process, and in the silence of its fall, the ghosts of those it oppressed, the wives, the children, the conquered, remained as the only witnesses to tell its true story. Let me tell you one last thing, because this matters more than you might think. Empires fall, armies crumble, monuments decay, but the pain they cause never truly disappears. It lingers in collective memory, waiting patiently for someone to listen, someone to bear witness. Amelia's voice was never written down by historians. No official record documented her tears or her quiet courage. Yet through her silence and the silence of thousands like her, she speaks across the centuries for all those who survived the wars that men celebrated. For every Spartan victory that made it into the history books, there was a mother who lost her child, a wife who lost her name, a life transformed into nothing more than a tool of power. When we speak of Sparta today in our movies and books and games, we speak of discipline, bravery, endurance, of warriors who never surrendered. We quote their sayings, glorify their military prowess, and call them legends. But we rarely stop to ask the harder question. What did it cost? Who carried the suffering that made such legends possible? Who paid the price for that bronze-clad glory? The truth that history tries to avoid is that Sparta's greatness was built on a lie. The lie that domination equals strength, that cruelty equals order, that the systematic suffering of others can somehow make a nation pure and virtuous. And that lie is not ancient history. It repeats itself in every age and every place where power becomes the only god worth worshipping. History is not just about remembering victories and celebrating the winners. It is about mourning what was lost to achieve those victories, about giving voice to those who were never meant to be heard. When you look at the ruins of Sparta today, scattered stones baking under the Mediterranean sun, you see more than archaeology. You see the price of forgetting compassion, the cost of treating strength as the only virtue worth having. The women of the conquered cities, women like Aemilia, were never meant to be remembered. The system was designed to erase them completely, yet their endurance, their refusal to completely disappear. It exposes the truth that Sparta tried so hard to hide, that real strength lies in the ability to protect rather than destroy, to build rather than break, to show mercy rather than methodically eliminate it. Sparta believed that fear could make a world last forever, that terror and discipline could create an eternal order. But fear only delays the inevitable end. It cannot build love or create art or establish peace. It cannot create a future worth living in or a society worth preserving. The unspeakable is not only what the Spartans did to the women of conquered peoples. The unspeakable is how history itself tried to bury these truths under layers of silence and glorification. How we turned monsters into heroes and suffering into statistics. So when we speak of power and strength and greatness, let us remember those who paid the price for such things. Because strength without humanity, victory without compassion, order without mercy, these are just different names for the slow collapse that awaits every empire built on the broken backs of the innocent. Do you think these forgotten stories change how we should remember Sparta? Should history focus more on those who suffered than those who conquered? Leave your thoughts in the comments below, because these conversations matter, and these voices deserve to finally be heard.